All right, boys and girls, we've got a good one for you today here at the Add 10 Gallons Concrete podcast. We're going to be talking about concrete history. And when I first heard about concrete history, or when I initially think about the history of concrete, I was thinking about more like, 1700s, in the Roman concrete and, all these other things. But in fact, it goes back even further than that. And which I think is super cool because if you think about it, concrete was one of the couple of things that really shaped human history. I like to think that I'm experienced in three things, and I'm really only good for talking about three things. One of them is hunting, one of them is agriculture, and the third one is now concrete. And those three things are like some of the oldest innovations and shifts in human history that we can think of. And after, we got Paul Ramsburg here with us to talk about the history of concrete. And I think after he gets to talking about those very earliest forms of concrete, I think we're gonna have the invention of the fire, the invention of the wheel, or the discovery of fire, the invention of the wheel, and then the use of concrete, kind of all in that trifecta of human civilization. So if you can't tell, I'm really excited about this conversation we're about to have. We got Paul Finley here with us too. I know he's excited, and Mr. Ramsburg. I know I got two Pauls on the podcast here, so I'm going to have to be careful. Just go with it, man. So day one, who first used concrete, and take it from there. I want to hear it all.
All right.
Let's go.
All right. Excuse me. So, the question is, where did it start? I think, honestly, we'll never know. We'll never know where it started because all we have left is the most successful attempts at concrete. And I bet you there's a whole lot of failures before that oldest success we found. I have this expression I do all the time. I usually have it at the end of a presentation, but I'll start with it. Bad concrete makes the news. Good concrete makes the history books. So when we look back in the history books of concrete, we're only seeing the successful attempts for the most part. And then also we got to define concrete. When we look back in history, we're not talking about Portland cement when we go to the origins. We are talking about some kind of calcareous material where we burn off the carbon and we're left with a quicklime type material. It's hydraulic, so we mix it with water and then we bind an aggregate together to it. So in the very loosest terms that we can possibly define concrete, we'll incorporate all of that. So now, what's the oldest concrete we've discovered so far is a really good question. And for that, we're going to go to southeastern Turkey. Southeastern Turkey in the valleys and the mountains over there, we find some pretty amazing sites. The one I'll start at is called Novali Chori. And Novali Chori is now, you can't access it now. You and I couldn't visit it because in the 1990s, they built a large hydroelectric dam across the Euphrates River and it flooded the site.
Mm-hmm.
World's archaeological community knew that they were going to wipe out an important site without knowing exactly what was there. So they flooded in and they pulled out as much as they can pull out all at once. They were just ripping artifacts out to save them, and they had a very short time period to do it in. So they pulled a bunch of that out and took it away and studied it later as the site's now under hundreds of feet of water under the Euphrates River. But one of the things they took out was a 1 square meter section of a floor of a building that's concrete. Now, you could visit that. In fact, I did. I went to this town, Şanlıurfa, Turkey, in eastern Turkey, and there's an archaeological museum there, and there's a massive room dedicated to this one chunk of concrete. And the Turkish government brags that this is the oldest piece of concrete ever discovered. And it's behind plexiglass, and the walls just have all kinds of writings of how the concrete was made and who was it that possibly had made it, and a little bit about the site. But it's a whole massive section of our archaeological museum dedicated to one slab of concrete. I got a guide, or one of the guards in the room, to take a picture of me with the oldest concrete I'm pretty happy about. What I thought was super impressive about it is you can see float marks in the surface. Like somebody took a piece of wood or wooden tool and smoothed the surface out, and you could still see the float marks in it. That floor was cast 12,000 years ago.
Wow.
So our story starts 12,000 years ago. Now, 12,000 years ago was still in the tail end of the last ice age.
Mm-hmm.
What's known as the Younger Dryas Ice Age was ending about 12,000 to 11,500 years ago. So just at the tail end of the last ice age, people were casting concrete.
Wow.
The more impressive site that you can visit. I got an opportunity to visit as a highlight of my travels, my global travels I've ever done, was a site called Göbekli Tepe. Now, Göbekli Tepe, a lot of people are hearing about now. It's probably one of the most impressive recent discoveries, and there's a lot of tourism around it now too. So people are flocking to southeastern Turkey to go visit this site, and it's a lot of circular monolithic stone carvings, so giant pillars, some of them 30 feet tall, and there's relief carvings of various animals and plants and designs that we're not sure exactly what they meant carved in there. Now, this is 11,500 years ago. And it is impressive. And as you go visit, when I went to visit, I got a local kid that was driving a taxi cab to be my guide for the week. And he was taking pictures and watching my back. And he was commenting, like, when I was there looking, everybody else around me was staring up at the pillars and, looking into the skies. People often go there and they stare into the stars and they contemplate all kinds of origin stories, whether the humans were building this for the gods or whether aliens had come and visited. But everybody's looking up, and he said, "You're the only person looking down." And he said, "What were you looking at?" And I said, "I'll tell you what I'm looking at. Something way more impressive than aliens. The floor. The floor is a concrete floor in a 1,500-year-old structure on
Wow.
top of a hill. Göbekli Tepe means potbelly hill. It's on this
Mhm.
large, rounded hill and surrounded by a lush valley in Turkey. It's kind of arid now, but back then it would have been pretty green.
Well, and I think Göbekli Tepe, as amazing it is for the concrete story, it's just as equally important for the human story. I think it'd be remiss if we didn't let our listeners know that if you're not familiar with why this site is so important, the fact that it's 13,000 years old and it shows this advanced concept of building, and is that we typically think, as the modern archaeology theory, is that humans were still hunter-gatherers 13,000 years ago,
Mhm.
and that until we became an agrarian society, we didn't really and had plentiful food for folks to eat. Didn't really have the ability to become non-nomadic. That we were able to stay in one place. That we were able to develop art and culture and laws and society the way that we think of it today. So Göbekli Tepe is potentially rewriting human history, and concrete's part of that.
Yeah, it absolutely has. It's pushed back in the timeline of where we thought humans were at the time and
Mhm.
what we knew hunter-gatherers could do. Well, I thought that was interesting. I'm glad you brought that up because before there was a Joey the farmer, there was a Joey the concrete finisher. The concrete place there is older than human agriculture. So, I liked it. I was standing on top of the hill and looking out over that valley, imagining it being lush with herds of animals going through and water. And I thought, I know exactly what that Neolithic concrete finisher was thinking when he was done with that job. He was thinking, those guys shorted me a yard because concrete finishers haven't changed in 10,000 years.
Yeah, I've seen several concrete finishers that haven't really evolved much in 12,000 years, let me tell you.
But it has changed that. People ask me too when we talk about, well, how did they make that concrete? And these pillars, these giant pillars the site's famous for, are T-shaped, and they would carve them out of the limestone bedrock. And then when you're done, when you tilt it up and you stand up the pillar, you're left with a hole in the bedrock and a lot of dust and chips of limestone. They would sweep them into the hole, and then they'd put in some clay, and then they would use pine, which was at the time in the area, and start fires, and they'd burn off the carbon, and now they're left with quicklime. Then that's mixed with sand, and then they, much like the Romans, they packed in large stones and then spread the mortar in through the stones and then finished it flat. But this site is extremely impressive site. I couldn't say enough about it.
So
Yep.
what made those people think, who got the bright idea? I was like, okay, I mix this stuff with some water, it hardens. What did they build with that? I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is, like, how do you come up with the concept of just concrete in general? Like, I can mix this stuff together and build things with it. Like, what do you think happened those first early days there?
That's great. Now we're in the world of pure speculation.
That's our favorite world, by the way.
That's I live in
Me
that
too.
world.
Me too. But here's what I think probably happened. What makes the most Occam's razor, the
Hmm.
simplest solution is people have a limestone bedrock habitat. It's a flat rock. They built a lot of bonfires for whatever reason, stay warm, ritual bonfires. Over a repeated period of time, the bonfires heat up and cool down the limestone bedrock, and then rainwater falls on it as well, and eventually becomes extremely flat and extremely hard surface.
Mm.
Just accidentally, they kind of understand that heating up limestone and getting it wet makes a pliable surface that eventually rehardens. And then it's not a hard leap from there to say, well, let me do it intentionally because I want a hard floor over here when I accidentally created one over here. That has to be mostly, I think that has to be where humans kind of come up with the idea. And I bet you dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of different tribes of nomads had come up with that idea all within the same period of time.
Hmm.
Once we control fire, it's a short leap to controlling cement.
Right.
Silly putty and concrete, accidental inventions that change the world. I like it.
That's right. Sometimes when I give this presentation, I start a little further back. There's a natural deposit of cement, quicklime cement, in Israel and the Levant Desert, which we don't know how it started, but we speculate it was tar sands with limestone, a lot of limestone in the area, and lightning has started a fire, and it created this massive burning, which creates what's still today a usable quicklime cement. You and I could take a loader bucket out there and dig cement out of the ground and build something out of it that's usable. Not modern structures, but usable cement existed on Earth before people existed on Earth.
Wow. So kind of what's the next stage? This starts out obviously very primitive, just mixture of materials that gets hard. So what's kind of the next stage when they start to refine the concrete mix itself, when they start playing with recipes, I guess, so to speak?
Yeah. So that is the idea of systematic. Let me drop a few more peoples because I want
Okay.
to show or illustrate how all of humans are doing this at once. There's no human civilization that's not playing with concrete. So while Göbekli Tepe is happening, just a few thousand years later, 10,000 years ago, the Americas were coming up with concrete on Hilton Head Island. In fact, the Smithsonian has researchers on Hilton Head now that are digging up spots. There was a people there called the Yamasimi peoples, the original peoples of that area. And they built a lot of things out of oyster shells. I mean, there's tons of oysters in Hilton Head, South Carolina. But they would burn the oyster shells and create a cementitious material. They didn't build anything out of it, though. They would cremate the remains of their people, mix it with that cement and aggregate, and then bury it in the ground, let water intrude into it, and they create these slugs of concrete. And that was their burial. So now when you build a bridge across through Hilton Head Island, you'll dig up dozens of these concrete slugs that are native people burial ground.
Wow.
And the Smithsonian studies them, then they gift them to the natives that are there in that area now, and they rebury them on their. But there's a people that invented concrete but never thought to stack two blocks on top of each other. There's also concrete slabs all through the Caucasus Mountains down through Israel, modern day Israel, that are 8 foot by 8 foot squares, 3 inches thick. And they're cast on top of compacted sand beds, and they're floated kind of upwards on the edge. We think they're like a floor slab for housing. They existed for about 2,000 years, and then the people stopped making them. So we have these time periods in all human civilization where people start using concrete, they get really good at it, and then it disappears. They forget about it for whatever reason. The first people to write down anything and to do concrete systematically was the Chinese. So China, 3000 BC, we start to see concrete structures exist, but they actually write down what they're doing. We hear a lot of rumors about where admixture started or where certain materials started. The Chinese actually wrote it down so we know what their intentions were. There's a city called Nanjing, China. A lot of the city is concrete, from lintels to walls to waterproofing plaster they're putting on structures. And they write down the materials they're putting in it include sticky rice. So sticky rice, probably the first waterproofing admixture to be added to concrete. There's researchers at the Sichuan University, which have translated documents spelling out the use of pig's blood and sugar in concrete. That's from 2300 BC. So pig's blood would be a water reducer. It would make concrete stronger. Sugar would be a retarder. It would allow you more work time to work with the concrete. So here we see systematic experimentation with concrete as part of a civilization building to bigger heights versus Neolithic people just going on experience.
Golly.
Joey's long said on this podcast, you can put just about anything in concrete and make it work. So you've just expounded on that list. Man, excited. What's next on the course of the history of concrete?
Yeah, that is a good point. And I think the human history has been, let's put this in concrete and see what it does. The Egyptians get a hold of concrete. They do a little bit with it. The Phoenicians get a hold of concrete, and they make some pretty interesting discoveries. So the Phoenicians are a seagoing people that focus on the Mediterranean, and mostly they would be based out of, like the Eastern Mediterranean area. They built a lot of concrete ports into the Mediterranean. But the choices they made are interesting. They didn't write it down, but they would go far inland to gather aggregate to use in the concrete ports that were built into saltwater. Also, the Phoenicians invented manufacturing glass. They were the first people to kind of manufacture glass on any large scale, and they'd use the slag, the waste from glass manufacturing, to put into concrete. So they're using a pozzolan, like slag, and they're using special harder aggregates in saltwater construction, but only in saltwater construction. So it seems they understood the damage saltwater would do to concrete and how to combat that, even though they didn't write it down.
Wow.
But
Incredible.
At this point, so we did China to the Middle East to Egypt. Now I want to focus on a culture that I'm really excited about. Now, this is a culture that's renowned for massive building projects and for discovering that volcanic ash makes concrete more durable and more strong. Who do you think I'm talking about?
Sorry, I was muted. Talking about the Romans is what I would think you're talking about, and then you're going to tell me
about the Mesoamericans.
Didn't
Before
say Romans. I was like,
let's talk about the Mayans.
I was going to say Romans. I just knew it was wrong because I was like, no, there's no way.
Yeah,
no
I
way.
tried to trick you. You knew I was trying to trick you. But before we even get to Rome, we got to jump back over to the Americans, to the Mayans. Now, I'm going to say Mayans a lot, or Mesoamericans. Really, it's a series of cultures. You start with the Mayans. There's an excellent site I'll talk about that with the Totonac people. Not a whole lot of people heard about them. They only existed for about 300 years. And then, of course, the Aztecs as well. But all these Mesoamerican tribes and sub-tribes were all working with concrete. Mayans originally had developed a mortar and stucco with quicklime. He eventually started producing concrete, and mostly built with his beams in a kind of a lintel construction system. They made concrete roads. They made concrete cisterns to hold water. They used concrete in the plazas of their civilization. What's funny, I think, or an interesting point, when the Mayans burnt cement, when they created cement in their kilns, no women were allowed anywhere near that process because they thought the cement kiln was feminine. Cement was a feminine product. And if women came around the process, the cement kiln would get jealous and would produce bad cement. So I don't know if that's guys decided to, if cement didn't turn out bad, let's blame the women. Right now, when your concrete's bad, you blame the admixture producer. But I think that's when it started then. We've come a long way in the industry, though. So,
yeah, you blame the newest thing in the mix, no matter what it is. It doesn't matter if you got a new water line in there, a new water source. It's got to be the water, like anything bad that happens.
Yeah, I tell you, Paul, there for a little while, you were off the hook. Everybody's blaming 1L Cement. I mean, you didn't get any calls, did you?
Yeah.
Super flat sizer. Somebody else invent something new for me. In 1996, there was an article, the ACI paper came out. There's a bunch of journal articles that come out, and all focused on this city, this ancient site called El Tajín. El Tajín is near modern-day Veracruz, Mexico. This was a Totonac site. This is still probably one of the more impressive concrete sites. So you're looking at 900 BC, and a huge portion of the city is made of concrete, and they're using volcanic ash. So they're using volcanic ash and concrete centuries before the Romans had attempted to do that, or anyone in Europe had figured it out. So the Totonac, or the Mesoamerican people, had figured it out long before the Romans had figured out volcanic ash would make the concrete stronger and more durable, and they used it to make the concrete waterproof often as well. There's this is on my travel list. I haven't made it there yet, but there's a site there in El Tajín that has the world's oldest known elevated concrete slab. Thousand years before Europe had an elevated concrete slab, there was one in Mexico. It's about 12 foot off the ground, supported by columns, about an 8-inch thick concrete slab. It's fiber reinforced with plant fibers. It's fiber reinforced. It's pigmented with ochre. So pigmented, fiber reinforced, elevated concrete slab. Very, very early mastery of concrete construction.
That's incredible. These columns, are they cast columns, or are they just like almost like block columns? Okay, so when do we start like casting the columns and structures like that instead of just putting blocks together?
Now we're coming close to the 19th century before we're building
Really?
total concrete. Yeah, it takes a long time for us to build total concrete structures. One of the oldest known cable stay bridges was in Mexico. There's another Mayan site there that had complete columns, abutments, everything made of concrete. And it was the longest bridge in the world until the 14th century when the Italians built one longer.
Wow.
And so for nearly 1,000 years, the longest bridge in the world was concrete. But the newest thing being studied in Mesoamerica is this site in a city called Copan, Honduras. And they're looking into the use of tree bark to make a liquid admixture that would make concrete waterproof by encouraging a crystalline a crystal growth within the structure of the concrete. A crystalline admixture, a liquid crystalline waterproof, and that's from 800 AD. So well over 1,000 years ago, the people were coming up with a admixture to add to concrete when they needed the concrete to be waterproof.
They can imagine like resin, because they could use resin for air entrainment, right? Yeah, could have done that, make it a little bit lighter. But this topic is so fascinating that there's possibly who knows how many construction technologies, and insights that we just lost through the course of history. And you're bringing up some that, as a fan of that type of conversation, I haven't not heard some of these. It's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I never really start out to dig into concrete history, except years ago when I was working for a producer in Pennsylvania. We needed a little presentation to kind of fill in some time in the middle of a day of education. So they asked me to develop a fun topic. So I started down a path, which led me to joining the Construction History Society of America and buying every book I could on concrete history and kind of compiling the interesting things. And when I present this, I try to focus more on the stuff people haven't heard, because there's a lot of concrete history we all agree upon. Also, there's a lot of conflicting stories in the concrete industry too. So I try to pick ones that are fun.
Where do you put ACI 211 in concrete history?
I'll get to that. Absolute volume mixed design.
Yeah.
Not the Mayans, but it's coming.
All right, great. So tell us what's next. Are we still in Mesoamerica? Got more stories for Mesoamerica?
No, we could talk about them for 3 days, but let's get back to Rome. So we really want to focus a little bit of time on Rome. I wanted to take some credit away from the Romans, but we still got to give them a ton of credit, right? The Romans did a lot of work with concrete. They made it extremely systematic, and they built more than anyone else. So I'll focus on a few things. The Romans really did write down a bunch of information on pozzolans, or pozzolana, as they call it. And in case you haven't heard the story, the word pozzolan, which may refer now to fly ash or slag or one of these other supplementary cementitious materials, it comes from the Roman town of Puzzoli. Puzzoli is on the side of Mount Vesuvius. And Pompeii, which later would be consumed by Vesuvius, that's at the foot. Pompeii was a concrete city. Everything in Pompeii was built out of concrete. And most of that concrete had a pozzolan dug up in the town of Puzzoli and then brought down to made very strong and durable concrete. But they had 4 types. They had what they called black, white, gray, red pozzolan, and they're all from different materials that had burnt in the volcanic eruptions. But they would understand when to use one for waterproofing, when to use another for strength. So they had choices of pozzolans that they systematically developed. The Roman legions, as they conquered the known world at the time, a Roman legion would have to know how to build, would have to be trained in concrete construction while he was being trained in warfare. So your average legionnaire wouldn't know how to build a concrete road or some kind of structure. So that's how important construction was to them. But in Rome, I want to focus on a person, and that's Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, or we just know him as Vitruvius. And Vitruvius in 15 BC, the Architectural Book 2. And while I'm reading Book 2, I'm reading the quality control documents for the building I'm setting under. It's a Pantheon. And it's amazing that we can still read what they were doing 2,000 years ago. But what's impressive in the architectural is Vitruvius lays out what I think should be the motto for our industry. He says this about all Roman construction, but he lays out the Latin phrase firmitas, utilitas, venustas. It means strong, useful, and beautiful. And that's what concrete construction is supposed to be, strong and beautiful. But he does a lot of things in this book. And one of the quotes from it I think is impressive. And he sat through some pre-construction meetings, because he writes in there, "May the architect be high-minded, not arrogant, but faithful, just, and easy to deal with." And he's lecturing architects on being easy to deal with. So I know he's sat through a few meetings. He explains the importance of keeping the concrete surface moist so it doesn't crack. 2,000 years ago, he's writing down how to deal with shrinkage cracking. I'm still telling people how to deal with shrinkage cracking. We've known that for a long time. He explains how to make pigment out of natural materials like berries or milk and different things for concrete. He talks a little bit about using horsehair as fiber reinforcement. What I think is really interesting, he lays out a method for determining whether a sand would be suitable for use in concrete. So we take a new linen, a white linen, we put moist sand on it and then shake it out. And if it leaves a colored stain, then the sand should not be used in concrete. He's on an organics impurity test or a clay silt content test 2,000 years ago. First ASTM standard, maybe.
It's incredible to think about, all three of us are well-traveled. Paul has been everywhere, for work, with Actigel and everything else. And I've been, South America and Canada and Mexico, Central America, and Ramsburg. You've been literally all over the planet chasing concrete history. The one thing that seems constant, at least in Paul and I's travels, when we go to all these different job sites, is that all these concrete people act very, very similar. It's almost like we're all the same people. It doesn't matter what country you go to. We just talk differently and we look different. I wonder, too, if we step back in time to all these guys working on the Pantheon, if it's still like the same cast of characters that we see nowadays. They just talk differently, look a little different, and they're still construction workers, even way back when. I bet it'd still be funny to go back and experience that.
I do experience that when we travel distance around the world. I bet you it's true when you travel through the timeline too.
It has to be just like this one constant factor throughout in human history is that construction workers are construction workers, and we just haven't changed very much.
Yeah. Well, we can't leave Rome without bringing up the Pantheon again. It's the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. I think it's about 62 feet diameter, 8-foot oculus in the center. It looks gorgeous. I have a pretty large zoom camera. I've zoomed close into the surface, and man, you can't even see a defect 2,000 years later. Wow. But it's a super impressive structure. What I think is interesting about the structure itself is the circular walls that create the structure itself that hold up the dome. Is not one continual circular wall. It's actually 6 different columns that look like a single wall. And over the years in the earthquakes, they've been able to shift. So that dome is just kind of rattling around on top of 6 columns that have shifted in the seismic zone. They never wrote down if they intended it to be control joints, but they certainly built a structure that was resistant to seismic activity. And you don't see any other ancient Roman structures around it because they all fell down in earthquakes. It's a highly seismic.
Do we know how long it took them to build that?
Man, I don't know off the top of my head, but I have read that somewhere. But it wasn't long. It wasn't
really
long. Yeah.
We're talking like years, like
just
a decade. I have no idea.
Less than a decade, handful of years.
Really, that's incredible.
It didn't take long for the Romans to build something when they set their mind to it.
Yeah.
Well, I sometimes think that's unrealistic. Not saying you're wrong. I actually want to support it, but sometimes I think those things are like unrealistic. How did these folks back then with limited tools, limited technology, how are they putting up in incredible structures in a quick amount of time? And then here in Pennsylvania, you get around the Amish, and buddy, let me tell you, when you're experienced building certain structures and you get a gang of them together to focus on one specific, it's the most unbelievable thing you've ever seen.
Yeah, you're right. We're not seeing the structures that the Romans figured it all out while they're building it. We're seeing the pinnacle of their methods of construction.
Yeah. You're not seeing the stuff that just ended up in the scrap pile.
Though in my activities with the Construction History Society, I met a professor, one who studies really bad Roman construction, So she goes to these sites around the Middle East where the front of the building is built perfectly, and the rest, the back, the sides, the floor, they're all falling apart and collapsing. And she just like kind of studies this late Roman Empire building cheaply kind of scenario, which is hilarious to see that there's even contractors then giving in to putting some shortcuts in the back.
Exactly. Well, or at least they understood that there was a premium concrete and then not premium. They put the premium on the front.
Yeah, that's right.
That curb appeal, man, it makes a big difference.
Maybe they just had it. Maybe they had a good admixture salesman who came along and told them what to really use.
Yeah, I'm sure. All right, so we could spend 3 days talking about Roman concrete. For the sake of time, we'll move on and let the Roman Empire get sacked by the Goths and fall. And often we think of that as another concrete dark age. We've had a few already where we get really good at it and it disappears, but it didn't disappear completely. After Rome falls in Europe, we have the Holy Roman Empire. It's German medieval folk is what the Holy Roman Empire is. But there was an emperor, Holy Roman Emperor Henry II, who dedicated himself to building things out of concrete. And he built, 60 structures we know about in 38 different sites. They're all religious structures, but he built them completely out of concrete. They still exist today. So it's all over Central Europe. You have a bunch of concrete structures. What's interesting about Henry II and his efforts, all concrete up to this point was mixed by humans with a hand tool. You might have a wooden shovel or something you're mixing. Henry II and his people invent a machine for mixing concrete. It's still built out of wood, and you may strap mules or horses to it to spin it, or a lot of slaves or somebody. But now you have a mechanized geared machine by people spinning in circles. It's mixing concrete, and it's in a bowl dug into the ground. But the first concrete mixer was developed by Germans, and we still have a lot of German concrete mixers in our industry. But that's the oldest known mechanical concrete mixture was from the medieval times during the Holy Roman Empire. So it doesn't disappear completely, and there's still some concrete civilization happening at the time.
Why is that, do you think? Like, why did concrete kind of get put on the back burner during that time?
During these times of crisis, we forget about innovation, right? It's just about what am I going to do to survive today? What am I going to do to get through the next harvest season or the next few years? And we actually kind of doing this in American culture for a while. Like we build we stick build homes because we're going to sell them eventually and move into another house. And in American society, we plan on having a few houses and keep moving on. But different parts of the world build more out of concrete than they do out of wood because they plan on buying the house and handing it down to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So when we think long-term as a civilization, we tend to build more with concrete. And we're thinking about the next harvest season. We don't invest a lot into the technology.
I gotcha.
Whether we're civilization-minded or not.
Right. So what's next? What's next on the timeline?
We're going to take a big jump from the medieval times to the Victorian era. So concrete exists this whole time, but it's not being used a whole lot. The project I'll focus on is called the Eddystone Lighthouse. So about 50 miles south of England in the channel there, or off to the west of the channel, is a series of rocks called the Eddystones. They barely stick up above the ocean. So hundreds of shipwrecks, thousands of sailors died there of ships trying to come into the south of England. Queen Victoria decides we need to do something about this. British are expressing their mastery over the ocean. So they go out to build a lighthouse. And they build a stone lighthouse. And a hurricane knocks it into the ocean. And then they build a lighthouse that's mostly wood covered with tar, and the lights fire. So it burns down and falls into the ocean. They build a lighthouse a few years later out of steel. The steel corrodes, collapses, falls into the ocean. Queen Victoria says enough is enough, decades of playing with this. She gives a project to a fellow named John Smeaton. John Smeaton's the first person to be called a civil engineer. So the father of all civil engineering, John Smeaton's given the task by Queen Victoria to conquer the Eddystones, to conquer the ocean. He builds a lighthouse utilizing concrete. He looks at ancient Roman concrete, makes a couple small changes to it, but virtually he's using ancient Roman concrete to build a lighthouse. And it works. It doesn't fall into the ocean. In fact, it's there for 100 years, saving lives out in the ocean. They had to take it down. They didn't take it down because the concrete lighthouse was corroding. They took it down because the rock it was built on was deteriorating. So The British take down the Smeaton's Lighthouse, they move it to Portsmouth, England, and they put it back up. We could go tour that now. We could go take a tour and climb this lighthouse, the ancient lighthouse. But they rebuilt a new lighthouse right out by the Eddystone Rocks, and they made the new one out of concrete itself too. But this was such a big deal for the British that when Queen Victoria was put on the pound coin for her Jubilee celebration, the only thing on the front of the coin is her face in profile, and behind her head is the Eddystone Lighthouse. So when Queen Victoria wanted to brag about the biggest accomplishment of the Victorian era England, it was conquering the ocean with this one concrete lighthouse.
Wow.
So that really fires up people's interest in concrete again. But so now we're going to go really fast.
I kind of want to pause here in the Victorian area, or at least I want to ask, or you can get into it after you get done with the Victorian era. In the back of my mind, I was just wondering, when along the timeline are we using crushed aggregate and like graded aggregate instead of, I'm assuming, early on we were just using gravel and whatever that we could find. What part or what time in the timeline are we like crushing our own aggregate to make concrete with?
Yeah, so it becomes more widely accepted in the early 1800s. We're already crushing a lot of limestone to make cobblestones.
Right.
So it's easy to take that crushed waste product from cobblestone to use in concrete. Like everything else in concrete, we find a waste material and decide, does it work in concrete?
So we still in our main timeline here. We still haven't got to crushed aggregate yet in the Victorian area.
There, though.
Still not there yet. That's wild.
We're almost there. But one thing before we get there, and this spans a long period of time, but one thing I want to mention, because it's a part of our origin story of America. Every good venture needs an origin story, and our first one was Plymouth Rock, right, where the Pilgrims got off the ships in New England. Plymouth Rock, if you've ever been for a school field trip, it's pretty disappointing. It's a tiny little boulder, right?
Yeah.
But somebody carved 1620 on the side of it, the date where the Pilgrims supposedly landed. But after the Revolutionary War and we became independent, we were so happy, and we needed a national identity. People actually pried Plymouth Rock loose, put it in a wooden cart, and drug it around New England to libraries and courthouses and towns, and showing off, hey, this is Plymouth Rock. It's the first symbol of our new nation. And it fell off a wagon one day. It had broken in half. Plymouth Rock literally broken in half. And now you're going to look up a picture online. You're going to see the crack in Plymouth Rock. But disappointed, they took it back and they put it right back where it was, two halves of Plymouth Rock. And
don't ever touch that thing again.
Yeah. We fast forward to the American Civil War. And after the American Civil War, our country split in half. And we're looking for our original national symbols. We're looking for a symbol of how we can unify ourselves back into one country. So people go to Plymouth Rock, the two halves, and they put them back together with concrete. So if you go to Plymouth Rock now, you'll see an 1.5 inch gap between the two halves. That is literally concrete. It was concreted back together after the American Civil War to symbolize our country being stitched back together as well. So the origin story of our country includes concrete.
That's incredible.
What is it with the U.S. and our symbols having to be broken? We got the Liberty Bell here in Philadelphia. So my wife immigrated from Albania. I can't wait for you to get the section of this story with the uniqueness of concrete structures in Albania. But when she immigrated here when she was like 6 or 7 years old, and one of their third grade field trip was to go down and see Liberty Bell, and she didn't understand, like, why are we excited about this broken bell? It's such a strange thing to be proud of. But there's something in this era, maybe even pre-Victorian, I think maybe even built in the 1600s, that's in the Americas I'd like to ask you about. Down in St. Augustine, Florida, the fort that was there, do you know much about that? Could you touch on that?
Yep. The fort in St. Augustine, probably the original large permanent structure built in the Americas. It was built by the Spanish, and they brought some Taino people, the original people from Cuba, they brought with them. The Taino natives built a type of concrete they called cocaina, and there's little coca shells, and really kind of making a quick lime out of sea life, out of coca shells, and then they mix those shells into. So part of the structure is built out of that, but also the Spanish were bringing in slaves from Morocco, and the Moroccan people, North African people, they built a type of concrete called tabby, and tabby is oyster shell concrete, but it's very strong, made into blocks. So part of that St. Augustine structure is also tabby. So it's a combination of Native American peoples' concrete, and then the North African peoples had brought concrete technology. So that fort is still standing. It's still a beautiful fort. Very sharp edges on the side of it. It's withstood hurricane after hurricane and war after war, and still looks great. But it's two types of native developed concrete.
Yeah, no, it's really cool when you see it because you're like, man, I can't believe they figured this out 500 years ago to do all this stuff. I think it's right. It's like the 1500, 1600
Yep, that's
kind
right.
of time area. And,
Right
and
around
it,
1600.
when he says sharp, he doesn't just mean nice profiles. You got to be careful. Those oyster shells are sticking out. They didn't crush them necessarily. They're like whole seashells, rocks, whatever they could find to use as an aggregate. They used as an aggregate.
Yeah, and all along the southeast United States, there were structures built of this style of construction, either coquina or tabby or a combination from North Carolina all the way down through Florida and even in the Caribbean. And most of them are still there now. You can go visit them, and the wooden parts of the buildings were burnt down or blown away by hurricanes, but the concrete parts are still up and around. In fact, in Charleston, there's still people using buildings built in colonial era this way. They're still using them as shops and store fronts now.
Well, the only time I see cocaine anymore is they're using it. Golf cart pathways on Florida golf courses are made out of cocaine.
Yeah. Well, it's still good. It's still good material.
All right, so we're back in the 1800s, or getting into the 1800s kind of time frame. Is the story that you're telling us, are we still over in Europe? What's next on the list?
We're getting ready to spend a lot of time in Europe. Here comes one of the major milestone in the whole story. 1824, England, and that's Joseph Aspen. So 1824, Joseph Aspen takes out the first patent on Portland cement, and he names it Portland cement. So he develops what we can call Portland cement. It's not exactly like what we use today, but the closest thing we have to today. Portland cement was patented. He develops it in his kitchen. You and I could make it in our kitchen. If a guy in 1824 made it in his kitchen, we probably could too, with the technology we have. And challenge accepted. Years ago when I was in Pennsylvania, I thought I could do that. If he could do it, I could do it. And my cement salesman told me, no, you can't. It's impossible. I was like, no, he made it in his kitchen. I have a better kitchen than he had. So I did. I went out and made enough cement to make one 3x6 cylinder. And I got a little under 3,000 PSI with homemade cement. It's a whole other story. You could do it in Pennsylvania because the Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, probably the best limestone for making cement out of without pulling a lot of other materials in. But what's interesting is Joseph Aspen was arrested 4 times while developing Portland cement. All 4 times the arrest warrants say on them, pilfering dust from public streets. He was literally going out in front of his house and chipping up the walk blocks, the cobblestones, to get his materials to practice making Portland cement. But now's a good time. Why is it called Portland cement? So the most sought after building material at the time was cobblestone, limestone blocks from the Isle of Portland in England. So Portland cement had nothing to do with that, but that was the building material fetching the most amount of money at the time. So he named it after something that was already very popular. So it's our industry's first marketing scheme. Like literally out of the gate, we start Portland cement industry with a marketing scheme by naming it after something that's sought after. He doesn't really turn it into a business. It was his son, William Aspen, that actually turned the idea of Portland cement into a viable business. So the first Portland cement company was William Aspen. His first kilns still exist, and they were maintained by Blue Circle Cement for decades, centuries. But he was a very crooked businessman. I won't get a lot into that. But you can look at his Wikipedia page and you'll laugh at all of the terrible business practices he did and all those sneaky, conniving things that he did to get the industry off the ground. We definitely had a seedy start in the cement industry. The funniest thing I thought, he was trying to keep people to understand how he was making better cement than everyone else that was making quicklime. So he used to wear this little leather bag around his neck and all times, saw him without it. In it, he just kept these colorful glass crystals, like little glass shards, but he wouldn't tell anybody what it is. So before people fired up the kiln, he'd go and take out the little glass crystals and sprinkle them around the kiln and then go back and let them fire the kiln. He wanted them to think there was some secret magic ingredient. But he had this ritual of doing that. But he is a funny character. So a little bit of a sketchy beginning, and then if we want to be systematic, it's not long till the Germans get a hold of cement. 1838 is the first systematic testing of compressive and flexural strength. Portland cement's invented in 1824. 6 is when we start making compressive testing specimens. It didn't take long. But they're 6-inch cubes. Europe still uses a cube instead of a cylinder like we do. But that's when it was developed. Probably the most tested material on Earth. You think how many times a concrete test is done? It's been being done since the 1830s. And then in 1877, the German Cement Manufacturers Association comes out with the first standard for Portland cement. So for years, we followed ASTM C150 to standardize the cement. But it was 1877 when the Germans come up with the first standardized Portland cement spec. Also in the 1870s, this isn't super important in the history, but it's a figure I like to talk about. There's this guy, Thaddeus Hyatt. 1878, he takes out a patent for reinforced concrete floor slabs. But before that, before the American Civil War, he rode with John Brown in what we know as Bloody Kansas. So he rode with a group of people that were freeing slaves and starting slave revolts. It was a pretty bloody time in American history. Eventually, at Harper's Ferry, John Brown's captured as a standoff, and that sparks the American Civil War. Well, Thaddeus Hyatt was there, and he escaped. He never got caught. So Thaddeus Hyatt's watching them hang John Brown, and his first thought was, let me do something different with my life. And so he invented the reinforced concrete floor slab. Now, it wasn't rebar. He was reinforcing it with little shards of metal and piano wire and strings and stuff like that. But he does patent the idea. He also goes to New York City and casts glass blocks into sidewalks so that light can shine through to the tunnels below. This is the guy that patented that idea, came up with that idea. But concrete slabs, it's a milestone figures, and he looks exactly like you think he'd look. Giant white beard and really wild hair.
I'm glad you mentioned, the reinforced concrete, because that was one thing I had written down that came to mind. It's like, when do we start like reinforcing concrete without, animal hair and these, the quote unquote fibers that we've used for centuries now? Like, when does like actual, reinforcement, on a grander scale come about? So I'm glad you mentioned that. That's pretty interesting.
And we were right up on it in the late 1800s. People were starting to play with the idea. This is one of those areas, like I mentioned before, where there's a lot of conflicting stories. People like their version of the history. The beginning of rebar is, there's so many different stories of who did what first, and they're all nuanced. So I'll tell you the one I like to focus on is the project is Alvord Lake Bridge in San Francisco. So Alvord Lake Bridge in San Francisco is still there, still standing. One of the first projects to use what we could call rebar. So like steel bars, they were square bars, but steel bars and deformed on the surface to count as rebar. And they built the whole structure as a demo to demonstrate the importance of steel reinforcement in concrete. Most of the structures built in the U.S. weren't reinforced. No one liked the idea. Too expensive, took too long. Terrible idea to them. The guys that built Alvord Lake Bridge also built a handful of other 3-story structures around San Francisco. Do you know what happened in 1906 in San Francisco?
What happened?
Great earthquake. You've seen the YouTube videos where there's the Golden Gate Bridge is flopping around and cars are bouncing. And a great earthquake in the beginning of the 1900s in San Francisco. It levels everything in the city. All these wooden structures, unreinforced concrete structures, all level. You know what's still standing at the end? Alvord Lake Bridge and a handful of other still reinforced structures. Overnight, reinforced concrete becomes the thing. Immediately, people abandon unreinforced concrete, and the rebar industry is born, and it's there with us. We don't turn back.
Wow.
Yes. Right at the turn of the last century. And it was that success story of surviving seismic activity that birthed that.
And all it took was a major catastrophic event for the concrete industry to change your mind.
Well, it'll be interesting if these latest wildfires will be the catastrophic event that convinces people to start building homes on the West Coast out of concrete instead of letting them burn down.
Yeah, we're starting to see a push that way in Florida to protect against hurricanes.
Yeah, and I know in southern Alabama, the insurance companies were giving people like massive breaks. If you'll build your home out of concrete, different levels too. Like if you'll do the concrete walls and a concrete roof, like your insurance is practically free because we're not worried about your home ever burning down or blowing over. It's interesting you're able to tease all these concrete stories out of some really pivotal moments in history. For folks that I lived in Kansas City for a couple of years, and I didn't know this until I was there on the Missouri side. Those folks, Kansas and Missouri, like we think of it maybe as a basketball rivalry now, but a couple hundred years ago, that was some real bad blood, really bad, in some of the most horrific ways over some of the most moral righteousness. And then it was real. Folks really were on the right side of history, and they were. Golly, it was bad. And so to think that that could have changed the course of concrete history is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll zip through a few more things. 1891, the first concrete street in America is Balfourtain, Ohio. Put down the first concrete street.
I've been there. I've been there. Yep.
Drive on that now if you want. Every once in a while, I have to take a little detour on my road trip just to go drive over that road and send pictures to everybody I know, and they're all like, "Who cares?"
Well, and since you and I might be the only people not from there that have been there, there's nothing. There's nothing there.
So a different time period, but the very first elevated parking deck ever built for cars is concrete, and so the first concrete parking garage ever is in southern West Virginia, just south of Charleston. And I took a trip all the way there from Atlanta just to go see this parking garage and park in it. And I'm walking around taking pictures, and it is a very small mountain town, Appalachian people. And everybody kept coming up asking me, wanting to talk to me, like, why are you taking pictures of this parking garage? It is nothing to look at. It's small, it's graffitied, it's pretty dingy. And I kept trying to explain to them how this was the first parking garage. It's like ever, the first parking garage. And they would just shake their heads, like walk away. They couldn't believe somebody had come to the town to look at it.
I get that same reaction. If obviously our listeners can't really see the background, but I like to turkey hunt and I like to travel and turkey hunt and go to different states. I get that same reaction that you got about the parking structure when I tell people I go across the country to hunt turkeys. They can't believe it. They're like, those stupid things are eating out of my bird feeder in the backyard. Why are you traveling 2,000 miles to try to come shoot one? But people are wired different. I mean, we're passionate about certain things, and so it's well worth it. And they'll never understand it. Those people that you were talking to in that parking garage, they'll never understand that, but it's still awesome.
Yeah. I have a tribe out there that does understand it.
We all have our own tribes. Yeah, we have our own little communities. It's almost cultish at times, at least for us in the turkey hunting realm. It's a little out there.
Absolutely. Well, shoot, let's go on to another favorite figure of mine in the concrete industry in the U.S., and that's Thomas Edison. So It's about the time to kind of focus on him, the late 1800s. In the early days of cement production, you had these brick kilns, like in Aspen days. They're building brick kilns, and you could get so much cement out of a brick kiln. There were a few people that had come up with the idea of a rotary cement kiln, but never got it to work. So Edison didn't patent the rotary cement kiln. He didn't invent it. But he made a version of it that actually worked. So to me, he invented the rotary cement kiln. If you invent something that doesn't work, did you really invent it? But Edison bought up a few patents, and he tweaked it, and he made it way longer. So now the long rotary cement kiln. So he can make a lot of cement fast. That's 1880s. He can make a lot of cement fast. The first American cement company was the Edison Cement Works, based out of New Jersey. It's the first American-owned cement company. But now he had way more cement than anyone actually needed. So he had come up with this campaign of promoting making other stuff out of concrete. So he built a bunch of concrete houses in New Jersey. He built a bunch more in Gary, Indiana. I think there's 80 of them still standing in Gary, Indiana. Concrete houses. People still live in them. I say still standing. They're not ruins. They're houses being bought and sold on the real estate market still today. On the ones in Jersey as well, they're all part of a historic registry. But he had a lot of bad ideas too, which is the ones I like to focus on. So for a year and a half, the Lautner Piano Company in New Orleans made concrete pianos. So Edison developed the concrete piano, and the Lautner Piano Company manufactured them for a year and a half. They sounded terrible. The reports. There's not a single one that's still around now. People hated them so much they destroyed them. If you ever find a piano company, or concrete piano from 100 years ago, you scoop it up, because I'm sure it'd be extremely valuable. But the soundboard was still wood, but concrete absorbs sound, so that. But he made concrete phonograph cabinets, and they were popular, and you can still find them. They're extremely valuable collector's items. But he just had all these ideas. Let's make everything we can out of concrete, and because he had more cement than the industry was demanding.
Lord, how heavy is a concrete piano? A regular piano weighs, I don't even know. Like, it's incredibly heavy. How
Yeah,
much
you'll
does
never
a
help your
stupid
neighbor
concrete
move.
piano weigh?
But it's not a bad idea because there was a lot of people that were learning to play piano but could not afford a piano. Not every household had a piano. So Edison's thought is we make it cheap enough, every home in America could have a piano. And it was. A concrete piano was much cheaper than a wooden piano.
Really?
So it was an idea to make something that everyone could afford to have in their home. It just wasn't a popular idea.
It just took the entire family to move it.
Well, you better pick out a spot you really like because it ain't moving from that spot. You know, people are still making concrete sound boxes and stuff. So that's still today. Did you say he invented that, or he just tried to popularize it?
He developed as far as I know, he's the first person to ever patent a concrete piano.
Gotcha. You may be ready to speak on this failed invention. I love hearing about his modular homes he tried to build out of concrete.
Yeah, yeah. There is some success that came out of his efforts in the concrete housing market. He created steel forms for those modular homes that would fold, and it really was the birth of slip forming.
Yeah.
The steel forms he developed for modular houses, which didn't take off, the forming system stuck around. Reusable steel molds is invention of Thomas Edison. So there's all these little things that our industry still uses that he come up with first. Just the products he was making at the time didn't take off.
Well, I think originally he was trying to do the same thing your buddy in Rome was trying to do in book 2. You know, strong, usable, beautiful. And so he wanted to make these modular houses beautiful. So even if it was a one-story house that had like 497 mold pieces that all need to be fastened together all at one time, all in the right shape so that you can cast this concrete into place and make this beautiful home, and it was just too difficult. Nobody could do it. So he had to scrap the third leg. It no longer beautiful. We're just going to make rectangles, and people can live in them if they want to.
This is a little early, but I think a big gray rectangle is beautiful. I'm a brutalist at heart.
No, oh well, we're gonna disagree on that, but I still like you, and I want to hear the rest of your story.
Let's see, what else did Edison do? There's a lot of little inventions, I guess, we could throw in there, but there's a guy I want to throw in that came right after Edison. He worked for Edison in a laboratory, but he took the idea that concrete homes that Edison worked with. There's a guy named Grosvenor Atterbury, and he was an engineer and an American architect, and he worked with Edison on a bunch of stuff, but he worked on the concrete homes in Gary, Indiana. Then he took off with it as well. And what he developed is insulated wall panels. So you think about it now in the precast world, they do a 2-inch width of concrete, a 2-inch width or 4-inch width of foam, and then a 2-inch width of concrete on the back. And then you precast that and you put them together and build a structure out of it. Atterbury was doing that in the 1800s, into the early 1900s. There's pictures of him erecting these small precast panels. They're being taken to job sites on the very first Ford trucks ever existed, and they're bogged down. Right? There's people operating manual cranes to put them in place. It's crazy. The insulated concrete wall panel for a house, it did not take off in the U.S. No one liked the idea, but it was fast. It was a way to build a warm home very quickly. But we didn't need that in the U.S. They did in Europe in the early 1900s. 1919, this takes off in Europe because World War I decimates France. Most of France is flattened after World War I. They have a lot of people with nowhere to live. Atterbury he breaks from Edison, takes a bunch of people with him, and they start building precast concrete homes all over the French countryside so they can get people in houses very quickly. So the insulated wall panel precast home market takes off in the early 1900s because of what was developed by Edison's crew here in the United States.
Wow. That's incredible.
In the early 1900s, 1903, you see the Ingalls building in Cincinnati, Ohio. That's the first concrete skyscraper. It's 16 floors. For 1903, we'll call it a skyscraper. The guy who designed it and constructed it is a guy named Ernest Ransome.
Mm-hmm.
When he was a kid in the mid 1800s, he worked in a factory as a child, as all children did in the 1800s. You got jobs when you're very young. Mm-hmm. But the factory was burnt down, and a lot of people died. It was a traumatic experience for him, and his lifelong goal was to prevent that from ever happening again. Factory fires killing a lot of people. And that led him to the concrete industry. And he did a lot of studies. In fact, all the original studies on fire-resistant concrete were done by Ransom. He applied that to building the Ingalls building in Ohio, but he built a bunch of more structures of reinforced concrete that were resistant to fire, so to give people time to evacuate structures before they died in fires. Fire resistance is a selling point for concrete, and it all started in the late 1800s, early 1900s with this guy, Ernest Ransom, in Ohio.
Wow.
But here's the guy. If the Pantheon is like our touchstone of our industry, a mascot of industry is the Pantheon of Rome. Our patron saint of our industry, I think, should be Duff Abrams. So Duff Abrams is the third president of ACI. Duff Abrams invents the concept of the water-cement ratio. The first person to ever write a paper on water-cement ratio was Duff Abrams, promoting its importance for durability and strength. He did that in 1970, which means for over 100 years, we've known the guy with the water hose at the back of the truck was doing the wrong thing. Over 100 years, we've known that throwing that extra water in the truck was not necessarily the right thing to do.
Well, the name of thankful for that guy. That's the name of this podcast comes directly from that. As we add 10 gallons to the concrete.
That's right. Yeah, there's ways to do that right. I'm being a little facetious, but water-cement ratio, we've understood that concept for well over 100 years, and it's tied to the importance of our strength of our concrete. He also developed the first structure to use absolute volume mix design. The way ACI 211, the way we design concrete mixes, it was developed by Duff Abrams, and he wrote the first papers on it, and he designed the first structures railway, B&O railroad structure that he designed of it is still being used today. Before absolute volume mix designs, we had what we called 1-2-4 mixes. Now, when I was a young QC manager in the industry, I had a spec come across my desk. We were building a 10-story parking structure, and the concrete spec specified a 1-2-4 mix. And I was like, this must be some new technology I never heard of. Let me go ask the engineer. And I asked this old grizzled engineer, he's in his 80s. And I was like, what's a 1-2-4 mix? Where'd I find that? And he started laughing. He almost fell out of his chair. He said, that's 1 scoop of cement, 2 scoops of sand, and 4 scoops of stone. I was like, this is 10,000 PSI requirement. And this guy's specking a 1. That's been copied and pasted since the 1800s.
We ran into that in the stucco market. And we were working in that, and they were like, "Oh, this is a 3-to-1 mix." I'm like, "What the hell's 3-to-1?" He's like, "Oh, 3 parts sand and 1 part cement." I mean, sometimes we go 4-to-1.
Yeah, but we built the Panama Canal with a 1-2-4 mix, and it's still there, it's still being used. So let's not knock the old timers and the mix design method, but absolute volume is certainly a better way to be scientific about how we're making our concrete. You probably know Abrams most for his invention of how to ensure consistency in concrete. He invented a thing that used to be called the Abrams cone. Now you call it the slump cone. Mm-hmm. So the slump cone, the slump test method, was invented by Duff Abrams as well. So much of what we do to evaluate and design modern concrete was given to us by Duff Abrams. I like to think of him as the patron saint of modern concrete. But I think the best contribution he gave to each one of us personally and the whole industry, he wrote the first version of design and control of concrete mixtures. And in that, a friend of mine in the industry sent me a PDF scan of an original copy. I'd love to have an original copy, but a PDF scan. The forward of the original design and control, Duff Abrams writes why he coined the phrase mixed design. Before that, we called it mixed proportioning, just the math of putting together. But in here, he says that the intention of putting a concrete mixture together is more than just proportioning it. We designed it around the needs of the customer, around cost effectiveness. We designed about performance of workability, plastic performance, long-term durability, because everybody involved in the project has a hand in the mix. We're designing mix, we're not just proportioning it. So Duff Abrams gives us the phrase mixed design, gives us the concrete manual, design and control concrete mixtures, which we're still using today.
Yeah, we call it the concrete Bible. And whenever we're training anybody new, it's the first thing we hand them. Like, here, just read that, and might tell them where to start. But most answers you could ever need to find, this is a great starting point for those answers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. A dear friend of mine just a couple weeks ago gave me a 1950s version of Design and Control when they released in the 40s. And in it has a glued-in addendum for wartime cement. So they changed ASTM C-150 during World War II to allow for, I guess, various options because materials not being available because of the war effort. But it is a beautiful snapshot in history. So my goal is to collect every version of Design and Control. It is that important in our industry, that book.
Mm-hmm.
All right, but now another major turning point in the concrete industry, 1913. Very first ready-mix concrete company. Very first company. So up until this time, we built a concrete plant on site, and then we mixed the concrete for that site. Now the concept of having a permanent concrete plant and driving mixed concrete to you was the Coleman Company in Baltimore, Maryland in 1913, the first ready-mix company. The Coleman Company still exists, not in Baltimore, they're out of Maryland, but they still operate in the United States. But that's not that long ago, 1913, that ready-mix has only been around, for a little over 100 years. It certainly revolutionized all that we do.
Well, you said Baltimore, like someone who's from the Mid-Atlantic. That was really good.
Well, yeah, I'm from Northern Virginia. That's where I was born. Here's one of my favorite stories, too. 1915, the modern iron oxide pigment for concrete was invented by Lynn Mason Schofield. He builds his first factory in Douglasville, Georgia, just west of Atlanta. So that's the first modern pigment. Up to that point, we were using, if we pigmented concrete for all of human history, it was natural materials, natural dyes. But now we have a synthetic dye for pigment, iron oxide. And it doesn't take off. Can you imagine 1915 in the southeast United States? There's not a lot of demand for decorative. So he moves his operation to LA. And he's trying to get off the ground. He's struggling a little bit. And he's going to one of his neighbor's house party. And the neighbor invited him over was Groucho Marx. So for you young people, I talk about Groucho Marx a lot and his impact on the concrete industry. No one knows what I'm talking about. So Groucho Marx was an old vaudeville actor. And when the talkies first started, movies with sound first started, he had a troupe called the Marx Brothers. And they were the first comedy actors. And they were probably the hottest thing in all of Hollywood in the early 1900s. If you want to go to YouTube and watch, you should watch the movie Duck Soup. It might be the funniest thing you've seen.
They're still hilarious. Their comedy is still just flipping hilarious to this day. It carried very well. It's so funny.
It's all slapstick comedy. And
I know.
So Schofield goes over to Groucho Marx's house, and like a good concrete nerd, he spends the whole party drinking and talking about concrete. And he tells them all about pigmented concrete we can do. Marx is fascinated. He's building a new house. He wants everything in the house concrete. And he wants it all pigmented. Driveways, swimming pool decks, patios, all pigmented concrete. So Schofield does that. It turns out great. Groucho Marx is having a housewarming party, and he invites over his friend Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin sees the pigmented concrete. He wants pigmented concrete too. So Schofield does his. And so all these people in Hollywood see it. The rest of the country sees Hollywood actors are super into pigmented concrete. So the whole country takes off on pigmented concrete. So it's Schofield connecting with Groucho Marx is the birth of architectural decorative colored concrete in America. But it really takes off there. The Schofield company sold to Sika a few years back, but they still have the original locations, and they're still producing pigment today.
Yeah, and I lived in Douglasville, Georgia for a few years. They should have had a giant monument. I'm very upset with Douglas County not making sure that got done.
Yeah, it should have been pigmented concrete.
Wow.
So, well, let's take a little side point here. So we're talking about the Atlanta area and concrete. A few years back, Atlanta wanted to put a new monument near the High the High Museum of Art is our art museum in Atlanta, and they got with a professor at Georgia Tech, and they're going to put up a monument. They didn't make the monument to a person. They didn't make it to a thing. By the time they were putting it up, it was very controversial to make monuments to people. They wanted to make a monument to a concept, to mathematics and engineering and ingenuity. So they create this structure, which they named Stealth, but it's a giant concrete ribbon. It's like 30 feet tall. It's 60 yards of concrete. It's jet black. It's polished. It's razor thin edge, but it's absolutely stunning. No one even knows it's concrete. But now we're putting up a monument in Atlanta. We're expressing our interest in the future of our ability to build things with this kind of monument. It's pretty impressive.
Yep, I do remember that monument, and actually it was about that time. So you and I didn't really know each other before just very recently, and so it's nice to finally get to know you. But I knew of you, and in concrete history, you play a part in Joey and I's history of Actigel getting off the ground because Thomas Concrete in Atlanta was one of our first customers, and I needed somewhere to put my system, and you were like, "Hey, temporarily to get it out of the elements, I got a little shelter you can use." You didn't know me from Adam, and you just couldn't have been nicer. And I still to this day thank you for that. And I told you that the other day when I first met you. So it really meant a lot to me and Joey because we were still learning. And you could have been mean and hateful and spiteful, but you didn't. You said, "Oh, cool, yeah, let me help you out for a second."
Yeah, it's
And you did. So I appreciate that.
Southern hospitality, and we're all better off when we take care of the customer.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So we ended up winning an ACI, or I didn't. We didn't. Thomas Concrete won an ACI award for the use of the Actigel in a project in Atlanta, and you played a part in that by making sure that our product was safe on the site. So thank you.
Awesome. So now I think maybe it's a little controversial statement nowadays. One of the most successful government programs ever in world history is the United States Postal Service. I can't say enough about the U.S. Postal Service. I'm a little bit of a fan. That could be controversial. We could argue that another time.
Yeah, we'll have to argue that another time. I don't know where.
A lot of faults with the U.S. Postal Service, but boy, could they pull off some miracles that have never happened in any other civilization. But it doesn't feel that way when you're waiting in a line just to buy a stamp. 1920s, the U.S. Postal Service sets up airmail from New York to L.A. So they're flying across the country. We know how airmail got across country. Anyone flew across country. You flew by natural landmarks. So these airmail planes would look out the window, and you leave New York, and I could see the lights of eastern cities, and I could see Knoxville, and I could see Memphis. Oh, there's the Appalachian Mountains, and there's the Mississippi River. You're flying by landmark. When you get to the western part of the United States, there's not very many landmarks. There's a whole lot of country that looks exactly the same. So these planes would get lost. They'd be going the wrong direction. So in 1924, the post office began casting giant concrete arrows on the ground from New York to LA. Like literally these massive arrows. They're about 50 foot long, and they're a classic arrow shape. Like you picture drawing an arrow, that's what it was. Picture Bugs Bunny with a map, and there's a dotted line across the country. They made that. Every 10 miles, there was a giant concrete arrow laying on the ground across America, and the pilots would look out the window and they would see the arrows and they'd follow them across the country. They were usually painted white and they had lights on them to light them up. But it wasn't that much longer when radar and flying equipment was invented, so they weren't used much. Some of these still exist. Most of them were taken up as we built suburbs and houses and shopping centers, but there's still a lot of arrows out in the Southwest. It's just laying on the ground.
Wow. That's pretty cool. Can you find, are those locations kind of easy to find? Like, can you look up those locations?
You can. There's some of them that are kind of easy to get to. All of them revolve around a hike. Because if you're going to build a road or a house, they tore the arrows up.
Yeah.
But there are some. You can find pictures online where people hiked out into the desert to find the dotted line.
I'm going to make a note of that. I'm
about to say, you talk about your tribe. That'd be our tribe right there. Those people who are finding these arrows on purpose.
Go out to the Mojave Desert and look for a concrete arrow on the ground.
Yeah, I'm hoping there's one a little bit closer than the middle of the Mojave, but yeah.
Right. All right. Here's a subject I cringe a little bit every time I talk to. I shouldn't say that, but concrete pumping. Let's talk about the first pump truck. So forget the truck, just the first concrete pump. So there's German engineers Max Gies and Fritz Hull in 1927 make the very first concrete pump. The very first time a concrete pump pumped concrete was to a height of 125 feet and a distance of 130 yards. So that's pretty impressive for the very first time concrete was ever pumped. We're already going out the gate long distances. Then, that was in Germany. Holland, first concrete pump they did next was 1932. And then this patent kept incorporating more and more technologies to eventually turn to the concrete pump truck. But you think of the 1920s was when we first started pumping concrete. So in the 1930s, let's focus a little on the Hoover Dam. Now, Hoover Dam could be like a 6-hour discussion. There's a lot of concrete history of the Hoover Dam. We see that the first systematic use of modern air and trainers. There's a lot of milestones. Hoover Dam, the first project to the Sixes company that built it, first company to require hard hats to be worn on the job site. Like there's all these issues or topics we can discuss in the Hoover Dam. First masonry mass to exceed the Great Pyramids of Giza that humans constructed. A little over 3 million yards of concrete in the dam itself, million around the dam. What's I guess the impressive thing I'll focus on in the history of the Hoover Dam is there's about 100 people died during the construction of Hoover Dam. They fell off the canyon walls by doing rock work on the canyon. No one fell into the concrete at Hoover Dam. That was the Boulder Dam. People fell into the concrete. But they built a monument on top of the dam. You can still visit it now. There's a stone monument on top of the dam dedicated to people who died while they're making it. It's a touching memorial. On the floor of the memorial is a terrazzo star map. So it's exactly where our galaxy, positions of stars and planets and things in our galaxy were when the dam was dedicated. That will never repeat ever in history going forward or back. That star map will never be, those stars will never be in that position. So it's a time-stamped signature that will never repeat. And there's a little plaque there that explains why they did it. I can't remember the exact wording, but it was for when peoples not of Earth find this in the future, they will know when this structure was planted. We expected the Hoover Dam to last longer than humanity will last. Like when we built it, that's how impressive and monumental. Hoover Dam's not even in the top 25 largest dams anymore. But it's still an impressive structure, worth a visit if you're out for World of Concrete. But that's how impressive it was at the time we were building it. We thought this is going to last for an eternity. But that little star map is a little fun thing to go visit in the corner of the dam when you go.
That's pretty neat.
When we visited Hoover Dam when we were out for World of Concrete probably 10 years ago, I had this sense when I was walking over actually not when I was in the dam, but when I was walking over the bridge, just up the hill there, and you can look out down at the dam. You get the sense that it could be in the future, in 30,000 years, what we think of as the pyramids now, where you look at the pyramids and you say, how in the world did they do this? Because technology is different and it goes by the wayside. Maybe there's a loss of history for whatever reason, and people are going to look back at structures like the Hoover Dam and just wonder, how in the world did all of those primitive people build this thing?
Yeah, I absolutely think you're right. Yeah, that's the same thing I thought. And obviously, when they built the Hoover Dam, that's a thought they had too when they dedicated it. This is going to be discovered eventually by someone.
Wow.
Let me take a minute to talk about Deep Eddy. So some of your listeners may know Deep Eddy vodka. Deep Eddy vodka is named after a swimming pool in Austin, Texas. Deep Eddy was a swimming hole. It was a natural hole. It was concreted in, but it was the first concrete swimming pool. Now, we don't think a lot about that idea of a concrete swimming pool. So what? Someone had to figure it out. The invention of the concrete swimming pool in the 1940s basically meant we no longer had to walk to where nature told us to swim. We could bring water to where we wanted to swim. After these, we invent the first gunite or shotcrete swimming pools. Soldiers are coming back from World War II in the 40s. Suburbs are taking off. We're building a lot of homes. We start building swimming holes everywhere. So now we're not a slave to going to where the water is. We're bringing the water to us. And concrete made that possible. The concrete swimming pool, we did not bring or decide where we were going to swim. The decision was made for us. We're kind of conquering over nature using concrete after the fact. But since we're up to World War II, a little bit of anyone in a history buff, you're going to be at least a little bit of a World War II history buff. But I like to look at what some of the Axis powers did with concrete, and I think it gives us a little glimpse into that culture or that way of thinking too. So let's start with the United States. What did the United States do with concrete? We built what's called the Kiptopeke Fleet. We built a fleet of ships. We built 14 ships that served in the Atlantic during World War II. 5 of them were sunk by German U-boats. These concrete ships were cast in Port of Tampa and then used to carry goods over to England and soldiers of supplies over to England for the war effort. After the war, the surviving 9 ships were brought back to Chesapeake Bay. There's a park there now called Kiptopeke State Park. You could still visit it. I got pictures of myself and people like at the ships. You could actually kayak out to them and climb on them if you want them. But they blasted them and sunk them in place to act as breakwaters. So these concrete ships served their country during the war, and now they're serving to protect the environment from erosion there at the Kipton Peak State Park in Virginia.
Wow.
But when they were cast, one admixture was utilized in the concrete. It was Sika Plastimate, which is still an admixture Sika sells in the market today.
Wow.
What I thought was interesting about the concrete fleet that the U.S. built, specifically to be used in World War II, is they named the ships after industry titans, after famous people. There was an SS Vitruvius, and that's still there in Virginia. There's an SS David Sailor Cement. There's an SS John Smeaton. We talked about that. There's an SS Vicat. There's an SS Henry Chatelet. Chatelet was the first person to identify the different components to concrete: tricalcium aluminate, tetracalcium aluminate ferrite, the 4 compounds. Let's see, the SS John Aspen. Every ship was linked to me. So building ships for the wartime out of concrete, there was enough concrete nerds on that project to name it after historical figures in the industry.
That's incredible. It's incredible to think about. Paul and I, we graduated from Middle Tennessee State, the CIM program there, and they still have the concrete canoe competition, everywhere. And it's wild to think about that they built giant ships out of concrete. Nowadays, a concrete canoe, it's still very, very interesting. It's super cool. But it's like that's more doable than building this massive ship out of concrete to go across the ocean. That's incredible.
Yeah, imagine be the sailor. You join up to the Marines, and you're the sailor, and they say, "This is your ship. It's made of concrete."
I don't know. All I'm thinking is they had to build that thing basically right over the water and drop the floor out. I mean, how are you going to haul concrete ship anywhere? They had to build it, essentially build it on the water.
The shipyard in Port of Tampa is still there, where they built all the. It was right there at the water. I don't know. That's very. I mean, they weren't the first concrete ships. There had been attempts at concrete ships a while before that, but the first successful use of them in the active duty and in the military. I thought that says a lot about the United States use of concrete to be very innovative. There's the deepest commercial submarine right now that has ever achieved the record depth is made out of concrete. There's a concrete submarine that has the record for depth achieved. Yeah, it was built in California.
Look, if you're trying to, I don't care what it's made out of. If you're going in a commercial submarine, I got nothing to. I can't talk to you. I'm sorry.
Yeah. All right, so let's jump over to Germany. In Germany, they built a lot of flak towers, and there's a bunch of them, but let's focus on Berlin, right, the capital during World War II. And a flak tower is an anti-aircraft tower, but they basically made a city. There were these massive cities, and the walls were 5 feet thick of concrete, which when we test now, we don't know what they're trying for, but they basically tested 8,000 PSI, 5 feet thick. There's multiple mats, sometimes up to 5 mats of what would be the equivalent of number 5 rebar, 6-inch on center. So heavily reinforced, extremely high strength concrete. And then they would build enough for a certain number of people to live in, and anti-aircraft weaponry on top. And the war ends. The Allied forces are conquering Berlin, and they decide that we need to get rid of this massive flak tower. It's a symbol of Nazi rule, and we need to take it down. The French shoot at it for 3 weeks with tanks, and they never scratch it. And then the United States takes over that part of Berlin, and they stack it full of dynamite and set off the dynamite. At the time of that explosion, that was the largest explosion in human history before the A-bombs went off, right? They cracked the back wall. They didn't take the building down. This structure, for months, they tried to topple this building, and it just couldn't be toppled. The U.S. had this great idea, well, let's just bury it. So we took bulldozers and we put all the rubble from the city of Berlin and piled it up on top of this flak tower. This is still the only hill in Berlin. If you go to Berlin today, there's one mountain or a hill in the city, and it's this flak tower buried by the old rubble. There are special groups will take you a tour down inside of it. You can still climb through it and see the whole structure inside. But it was pretty impressive what they were able to achieve with strength of concrete.
Could they not have taken a bunch of acid and just liquefied this son of a gun?
Could you imagine how long that would take? 5 foot thick walls.
How much do you hate the Nazis, Ramsburg? I'm telling you right now.
Well, my granddad flew across the Atlantic in a plane, jumped out of a perfectly good plane just to punch him in the face.
Yeah, mine got sent to the other theater. Mine was in the Pacific Theater, fighting the Japanese. Yeah, we're definitely on the good guy side of that. But yeah, I'd stand there all day blasting a fire hose of acid at this building. No, I'm just joking.
The other thing that is Hitler wanted to build a new pantheon. He wanted his own version of the Pantheon of Rome, but he wanted to make it 10 times larger than the existing pantheon. Now, the soil is not great in Berlin. So they did a soils test. In fact, the first soils test for a large structure. They built this huge concrete slug, which I'm not even going to begin to try to pronounce it. I'm Pennsylvania Dutch, and Germans laugh at me when I try to speak German because it's very different pronunciation. But they made the first systematic soils testing for building during this time period. There's a few contributions there in large-scale, strong concrete growth. The Russians were interesting. The Russians were sending a lot of tanks. They made cheap tanks fast, specifically the T-32. And they were sending them in, and the German anti-tank weaponry would take them out almost immediately. So they decided, let's coat the T-32 with concrete. So they did. They put a concrete shell cast on the side of the tank, which prevented anti-tank weaponry from harming the tank. It absolutely ballistic concrete worked great, but it was so heavy the tanks were easily outmaneuverable, and they were sluggish and they'd get stuck. So maybe not a good idea in the long run, but they were able to develop like this anti-ballistics concrete. England's interesting. During World War One, planes came across and dropped some bombs and caused havoc in London. So the British thought never again. They built parabolic sound mirrors on the south coast of England. Every few miles, there's these giant concrete bowls stood on their side facing south. And if you set a guy up in there on the edge of the concrete bowl, he could hear the motor from the airplane 50 miles away. So they had all this warning system, never utilized because shortly after they finished building them all, they invented radar. But they're still there. You could go sit on the inside of this concrete parabolic mirror now and listen to things on the other side of the English Channel.
Wow.
After World War II, the Soviets, they developed the first kind of systematic, standardized precast components. So they have shops that are just making specific size panels, columns, beams, walls, whatever they're making, not for any particular structure. And then architects and engineers are developing structures around the existing components. And that style of construction still exists in Russia and in Eastern Europe. But that's developed because the Soviets are, at that time in the 1960s, are bringing people from their farms into cities. They're industrializing the nation. So they need housing fast. And the way you get housing fast is concrete housing. So a lot of big gray blocks. 1960s too. A little side point, but I have a copy of this, so I like to show it to engineers. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in the 1960s develops a manual for converting steel reinforced concrete into bamboo reinforced concrete. And the manual literally tell you how to harvest bamboo, split it, dry it, and then your conversion charts for converting from number 4 bar to bamboo. There are a ton of structures all over Vietnam and Cambodia that the Corps of Engineers made in the 1960s, which are bamboo reinforced concrete, still in place today. So, all this time later, the system works.
Wow. You would think the bamboo like dry out and create a void and crack and everything else. Like, are those structures still being used, or are they just still standing?
Well, it's still standing. The ones I've seen in photographs.
Right. Wow.
Let's see, 1960s, Israeli-Canadian architect Moshe Safdie. He invents kind of this first being together like Legos. Was developed in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we should talk about the Opera House too. Sydney Opera House, certainly a mascot of our industry in modern times. Those, if you can picture it, those white sails they call them, the shape. Those are all concrete sails, are individually precasted ahead of time, but none of them repeat. Beautiful white concrete. It's about 200 feet above sea level where that concrete sails are. A little less well known is there's 12 stories of parking below sea level. So 120 feet below sea level is a concrete parking garage. It's generally regarded as the deepest basement in the world. It's an impressive concrete structure. 1980s, we see the invention of self-compacting or self-consolidating concrete. Comes out of Japan to address labor issues. Being able to vibrate concrete was a problem. So that's where we see the development. It comes through Europe and eventually to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Around this time too, we start to see concrete used more on tall buildings. The Burj Khalifa, is not the tallest building in the world anymore, but certainly a popular tall building. That's a concrete structure. In fact, all the top 10 concrete structures right now in the world, they're all concrete. We do not build our tallest structures out of steel anymore. We're only building out of concrete. There's a building under construction right now that will soon be the tallest in the world, and that one's also being built out of concrete.
Mm-hmm.
In the 2000s, early 2000s, we see the rise in popularity of ultra high performance concrete. So here we're talking about something in the vein of 30,000 psi, not 3,000, but 30,000 psi. A flexural compressive ratio of 20%, so double the flexural strength of conventional concrete. I've done some mixes here in Georgia, 26,000 psi, 18% flexural ratio. We did a Coulomb test on it, and we got 4.
Yeah, if people aren't familiar with that test, like your standard concrete is going to be at 4,000, and then you're trying to densify it down from there. You'd like to be 2,000 or less. Then you had silica fume, maybe you're less than 1,000. 4?
Yeah,
that's pretty insane.
The concrete has way less absorption than granite. Your granite countertop would absorb more water than this concrete.
Wow.
But that's becoming more widely accepted. Georgia Department of Transportation has a spec on utilizing UHPC in road construction. So it's not the space age cutting edge anymore than it was 20 years ago.
Are they mostly using it for bridge decks, or they're
bridge deck repair is where it's mostly being used. But precasters are making bridge beams out of it. We have a lot of successful load testing by DOTs on UHPC, so we'll see popularity UHPC take off, and it's a whole new world of what concrete can do. In the 2010s, 3D printed concrete starts becoming popular, modern 3D printed concrete. There's more and more opportunity for it now. There's a lot of large-scale commercial buildings currently right now being 3D printed. Of course, you see 3D printing housing. I think the challenge for 3D printed concrete is the aesthetics. If you like the one look it can give, great, but we need to figure out how to 3D print and have a better aesthetic or a different aesthetic. The concrete we're 3D printing typically is 8,000 psi or higher, so it gives us a lot of opportunity what we can make.
Right.
Another building I'll point out, and I didn't know where to put this on the timeline because it literally stretches from like the middle 1800s to still being under construction today, and that's in Barcelona is the Familia Sagrada, and it's a large cathedral in Barcelona. It's designed by the designer Antonio Gaudi. So Antonio Gaudi starts Familia Sagrada in 1882, and I think they're talking about completing the project in 2026, so next year. What's interesting about it is it's in itself, the building is a museum of masonry construction. So in 1882, they start the building by stacking rocks, so it's stacked stone. What they're pouring right now is ultra high performance white decorative concrete. So every technological advantage of concrete has been applied to the structure. So when you look from the bottom to the top, you're seeing the last 200 years of advancement of concrete history all in one structure.
Wow. Why is it taking so long? What's the reason it's...
It's a cathedral.
Okay.
Most of Europe's cathedrals took like 500 years to build.
Wow.
This one's fast tracked, right? Like Notre Dame was 400 years to build Notre Dame. So we're fast tracking this one, doing it in about 150 years.
Well, they had to rebuild Notre Dame the last couple of years.
But a lot of the spires on Familia Sagrada are self-consolidating concrete. But it's inside is a gorgeous structure. It's all white concrete with pretty complicated shapes. But when the light comes through the stained glass, the whole building inside lights up, all kinds of vibrant colors. It's an impressive concrete structure.
Wow.
The other thing is where we're going next. One thing we've been working on is lunar concrete. So concrete on the moon, extraterrestrial concrete. So NASA has looked into this quite a bit, and a lot of researchers along with NASA. But everything we need to make concrete already exists on the moon. We can use basalt and solar radiation to create a cementitious product. The aggregate obviously already going to be there. We can crush aggregate using solar radiation waves. But we need water. Well, water exists on the moon. In fact, the current space race is to the south pole of the moon because that's where the water's at on the moon. So what is there? All they need is a good QC guy and a mixer. That's, we can go up and start building. But when you look at movies, the lunar bases are always these tinfoil tents on the moon.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at what NASA's actually published, every lunar base NASA's ever put out plans for involves concrete. NASA's always thought that a lunar base would be made of concrete, not of other materials.
Well, there's good reason for that. Shielding from cosmic rays is probably number one on their list. Because you can always, even if the concrete itself wasn't enough, you could always paper over that with whatever type of foil or ceramic or whatever that you're able to generate. Just interesting fact of history, I would say, is the very first episode that we published of this Add 10 Gallons Concrete podcast. We did a segment on the testing that's going on at Penn State University, where they're using, they were looking at cement hydration in space. What is it like? Because the formation of cement crystals and how they hydrate is impacted by gravity. And so if you did it in an anti-gravity environment or a low gravity environment, does it change the way cement crystallizes? And it does. And so just being able to predict that and understanding that the strengths were as high, so we had to come up with other ways to think about it. And oh yeah, by the way, we're going to use regolith. We're not using, standard earth-bound aggregates. So if you're using lunar regolith, how does that change things? So it was one of the very first studies we ever talked about here on the podcast.
Yeah, that is awesome. Lunarcrete will be a whole new world we can get excited about. So if you don't mind, since we've gotten all the way up to modern times, I usually say this as like kind of an addendum. If you don't mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about pre-stressed concrete. So pre-stressed can be layered on top of regular concrete, but it's like its own little world. And for those who don't know, it's where you stress steel strand and then you pour concrete around it. And once it's hardened to a certain maturity, you cut the strand so the concrete takes the tension from the strand. That's what most bridge beams are made out of today, or pre-stressed bridge beams. And other structures too, parking garages and whatnot. But the first patent on pre-stressed concrete, taken out in 1858 in New York City. An engineer called Peter H. Jackson. Before the American Civil War is when the first patent on pre-stressed concrete was developed. Nothing that Jackson ever made still exists because he did not understand pre-stress. He patented it. He did not know it well enough to make something that would still be around. So really the father of pre-stressed concrete is a French engineer, Eugene Freyssinet. So 1886 to 1906, Eugene Freyssinet develops modern pre-stressed theory. And he makes a bunch of structures out of it, including a bridge. The first pre-stressed bridge still exists in France today. It doesn't look like a modern bridge, but it's where he developed most of his theories from. He comes up with the concept through making this bridge of creep. So we understand about concrete creep. It's deformation under compression. Freyssinet kind of develops these theories too, and it helps him perfect pre-stress. He develops all the tools of pre-stressing too. Well, he has a student that's working with him named Carl Maltner. When Carl Maltner was a teenager, he was a student of Freyssinet. After he graduates, he goes back to Germany, and he fights in World War I for the Germans, and he wins an Iron Cross for bravery fighting in World War I for the Germans. Then in the late 30s, he's thrown into a concentration camp because he's Jewish. So Maltner's now in the concentration camp, but before he went into the camp, he developed the first pre-stressed bridge on the Autobahn, which is still there. So it's like 1938, 36. But it's the first pre-stressed bridge that look like modern bridges do. So when you see a bridge, when you're approaching it, it's just the straight line over the highway, and you're crossing under it. That style of bridge is what Maltner develops. And he puts up a few of them. I think it's 38 is when he puts it up. But he's put into Balkenwad concentration camp, and the British know him. They've been following him. They know what he can do. They send British Secret Service to bribe and break him out of the concentration camp and his family. So British Secret Service rescues Maltner from a concentration camp in Germany and in the early age of the war, take him back to London, and the British government sets him up with the funds to start the very first pre-stressed company. First company dedicated just to making pre-stress, the Pre-Stressed Bridge Company of London. And he spends the rest of World War II, while bombs are falling all over the city of London and knocking out the infrastructure completely. Maltner spends the whole time making pre-stressed bridge beams. Not for any particular project, just making bridge beams, perfecting and making various bridge beams. After the war's over, all the infrastructure is completely wiped out. All those ancient stone bridges are knocked down all over London, and they need to get up running fast. So what do? They turn to Maltner, And he has all these bridge beams. So all the original beams to get London back up and running after the war were all pre-stressed concrete bridge beams. So concrete to the rescue, and Moltner as well. But pre-stress doesn't really take off very well. The few other people that develop long line forms and stressing equipment, but it's really a super niche industry until a professor at Ghent University in Belgium, August Mengel, and he writes the first pre-stress manual. He's a really good speaker. For the first time in pre-stress history, you had a smart guy who knew how to talk to contractors. And he traveled the world, and he told people about pre-stressed concrete. When he came to the United States, he came to Philadelphia, and then he came to Philadelphia in 1949. In 1950, but the very first pre-stressed bridge is in Philadelphia, and Mengel helps him design that. That's 1950. And then very shortly after, we see the Pre-Stressed Concrete Institute form out of 7 pre-stressed companies in Florida. So the industry takes off quite a bit after the fact. But I think it's interesting that our industry really pre-stress industry really hinges on this one guy who had a really hard time, 1940s Germany, and just people knowing and understanding what he was able to do. And that led to that modern bridge industry.
Well, and I can say nothing has ever scares me more in the concrete world than being in a pre-stress plant when they're stressing the cables, when they're stressing those strands. Woo! I don't. I've never seen one snap. Don't want to see one snap, but
I have. You don't want to see it.
I don't want to see it. Mr. Ramsburg, this was one of my absolute favorite conversations I've ever had. Really, really appreciate you taking your time to come and talk to us and educate our audience about the history of concrete.
So can I leave you with one thought on what all this meant?
Please.
So what's the difference? What's the difference between the Pantheon and the mall down the street with the sidewalk that's 3 years old and is already delaminated? Or what's the difference between the ancient structures that are still beautiful today, thousands of years old, and the concrete that's cracked and has to be replaced? Because they didn't have better cement than us. They didn't have better product than us. So what's the difference in that concrete? And the difference is workmanship. So it doesn't matter what you do in the concrete industry. Bring yourself to doing it right, and good workmanship is the key. Because like I said at the beginning, bad concrete makes the news, good concrete makes the history books. I'll leave you with that.
That's a good place to end right there. Paul, we can't thank you enough for coming on here today.
Yeah, thank you.
Really appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you at some more industry events. And thank you for the past. Thank you for the present. And look forward to seeing you in the future.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
See you, man.